All right, I think we are live. Share screen. Okay, and we're here. I think that's all in frame. All right. Hey guys, how you doing? I'm Joe Watts. I'm going to be your instructor this week. But this is more less instructing, more of a guide, because today we're going to be talking about the assessment plan and reflection paper. This is worth 25% of your grade. So please don't wait till the last minute to do it. I really recommend taking some time to really think about this. This is sort of this is sort of an accumulation of a lot of stuff that you've learned throughout the semester. So rather than just sort of throw it out there and just have you guys go at it, I figured I'd walk through what hopefully should be some of your guys' thought processes when it comes to doing this assignment. So let's take a look at it first. The top directions up here. Um, the assessment plan, it doesn't just provide data on performance expectations, but students, teachers, administrators, policymakers, and the public. So remember these stakeholders when you're writing your paper. These guys all obtain information about learning, so it's important to keep them in mind. It's a two-part assignment. So you have the plan, that's the sort of the dry part of it, where you have to adhere to a certain way of creating uh, the plan, talking about the content area, the state standards, stuff like that. And then there's the reflection side, which is you can add a little more of your personal touch to it. So again, part one, you design an assessment plan that includes both formative and summative assessments relevant to and appropriate for your specific content area. And the second part is you reflect on the utility and shortcomings of these assessments. So there is no one size fits all method for assessments, right? And you guys need to sort of look underneath underneath the surface and really sort of figure out in your content area what are the pros and cons of each of those things, because that's important, right, for your both your content area and for your learners. So also, this is going to be submitted as one file, so with a maximum of 10 pages total. Okay, so don't send multiple files, just one file. So it's easier for us to grade, and we don't have to go back and forth and stuff like that. So, with that out of the way, uh, let's go through part one. So identify the content area, state standards, and relevant benchmarks. So I thought this would be a useful time to sort of reflect on what we talked about in the very beginning. What does assessment look like in my content area? So you remember that there's a lot of facets of assessment, and it can be tied to um, it can be tied to a lot of examples and the ways that we implement it in our classroom in terms of knowledge and performance that students should be able to do. So uh, we think about these questions that we ask ourselves, right? The first is, what does assessment look like? And then from there, we want to look at what makes it distinct from other content areas. Because, of course, the way that we assess people in, for example, mathematics at a secondary level, let's say middle school level, for example, it might be different than the way that we assess learners who are in English language arts class in the 12th grade. So what makes it distinct, right? And maybe even similar to other content areas. We also try to ask ourselves the question of what are the implications for good assessments in our discipline. So, think about what types of assessment strategies are often used in your discipline content area, and how does that reflect what is valued within the discipline, right? So in science, my bread and butter, what that means is that we have these disciplinary core ideas, these standards. You probably remember them from your science classes yourselves. Let's take physics, for example. Newton's laws of motion, right? So the information contained within Newton's laws of motion are the disciplinary core ideas of the physics discipline of science. But no matter the discipline that we have, we also emphasize these core practices, and they might be things like obtaining evidence and using it in a way to be able to communicate a scientific argument. Likewise with our students. So we will assess them on their abilities to do that. So, how might this example of science be similar to or different from your own content area? These are things you have to ask yourself as you're doing this assignment. And what performances you want to support in students and evaluate in them. Um, so, in summation for this, this first part here, what practices and what knowledge does your discipline value and reward? So, moving on to looking at the next part here, construct 3 assessments for this unit and assess students' understanding of the standards and abilities to perform any practices that are relevant. Problem solving, thinking like a historian, analyzing data. And so this makes me think back at one of our other modules, if you remember. Um, remember that to connect assessment with learning objectives, right? So one of the strategies to do this is through a standards-based grading system. Standards-based grading is a form of assessment, if you remember, in which specific standards and their associated benchmarks are selected, and then we assess student learning alongside those benchmarks and the stepping stones they reach as they work towards proficiency and hopefully mastery, as opposed to just simply giving student a grade for the entire unit. In standards-based grading, we look at proficiency for a series of related benchmarks. So, you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the benefits of using standards, sorry, standards based grading approach compared to a more traditional approach that you may have gone through the educational system experiencing. Remember that standards-based grading also works equally well in secondary settings, where there are clear letter grades and associated GPAs. So the act of grading based upon standards is more about targeting the specific learning and performance that you want to happen, and you expect to see in students. You chart their proficiency along the way, and then assigning that proficiency with a category. On a related note, um, this also applies to the rubric that we designed for this assignment. So please make sure to look carefully at the rubric, the different points along which you are expected to follow and obtain mastery on. So, point 3 here, one assessment must adhere to a standards-based grading approach, like I said. One assessment must include the use of self or peer assessments. One assessment must be considered authentic for your content area or discipline. Keyword authentic. I'm sure that one rings some bells. Because remember, you explored this idea of authentic assessment as a way to enrich your classroom that you already have a place in, right? So authentic assessment requires authentic tasks that show student abilities, um, and that students receive feedback and redirection if necessary to allow for growth. Students have part in the process. You have to keep that in mind. And the outcome uh, of they have a part in the process and thus their own outcomes, right? And these are really important ideas that set the tone for what authentic assessment can look like. In other words, when assessment is authentic, we should be able to track how students are learning. The student should have a clear idea of the expectations and learning goals. They also need to have feedback on how to succeed down that learning path. Beyond that, the term authentic, indicates that this type of assessment is not going to be your typical multiple choice assessment or a unit exam or something like that. Instead, something that's authentic is going to mimic the actual practices that students would engage if they chose a career in the field or discipline. So there's extreme utility in teaching this way. Authentic assessment attends to different aspects of involving kids in the actual practice of their discipline and assessing them on their knowledge, skills, and abilities in these spaces. Okay, so remember the 3 questions about authentic assessment, right? Number 1, what makes an assessment authentic? Number 2, how do I create authentic assessments of student learning? And the final, number 3, how do authentic assessments improve my teaching and my student learning? So keep those 3 questions in mind as you're going through that subsection of part 1 here. So I wanted to recap. So that's recapping sort of a lot of material that we went through this semester, right? Part two here. Um, this is one that I can provide some guidance on, but really it's up to you to really fill the blanks here. Part one, the benefits, weaknesses of each form of assessment. Like I said before, it's not a one size fits all sort of shoe here, right? Um, keep your discipline in mind when you're talking about these benefits and weaknesses. Think about the other disciplines that may draw parallels or sharp contrasts. These are important things to keep in mind and would benefit you greatly to look into. Number two, which form of assessment you feel will provide the most useful information as a teacher. So this is where you get to draw from your own personal experiences in your educational journey. Number three, one suggestion for differentiating each assessment for exceptional learners. These may be students with special needs, gifted and talented students, or emergent bilinguals, or English learners. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Just make sure to please cite the resources that we provided you throughout the semester, and that goes for all of these points, by the way. Please make sure to cite your sources, okay? Um, a short summary of how, this is number four, a short summary of how you might share the results of the entire plan with parents to communicate their students' performance. So it's very different. It's very different trying to communicate with parents, as you guys know. So come up with a way that you think would be the most effective in communicating to them. That part should be no more than 5 double space pages. So the other one is also 5 double space pages for, again, one file with all 3 assessments and the reflection paper. Total of 10 pages maximum. Okay, so I think that's all I have for you guys right now. Remember to please follow the rubric. There are points throughout it that you may not, what do you call it, that you may not think are obvious on first glance, but are vital parts of the paper. So please make sure to review that. Ask us any questions along the way. We're here to help. And yeah, I've really enjoyed working with you guys this semester, and I can't wait to see what you guys do with this. So I will catch you guys later. Stop a share, and yeah, have a great one.